Picture this. You stand in the bustling heart of ancient Rome, surrounded by a sea of faces, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own dreams. You feel the pulse of the city, a rhythm driven by ambition, fear, and desire. And yet, amid this chaos, there is a man who moves with a calmness that seems almost out of place, as if he walks to the beat of a different drum. This is Hierocles, a Stoic philosopher whose name may not echo through the annals of history like Caesar or Cicero, but whose ideas have quietly shaped the way we think about compassion and human connection for over 2 millennia. Hierocles believed something that many of his time would have found utterly preposterous, that the boundaries of our compassion should extend far beyond our family, beyond our tribe, beyond even our nation, to encompass all of humanity. His vision was one of concentric circles, expanding outward from the self to family, to friends, to strangers, and finally to the very furthest reaches of the human race. But Hierocles was not merely a dreamer lost in thought. He was a man of action, and his philosophy was not confined to parchment or lecture halls. He believed that real change began in the heart of the individual and radiated outward like ripples on a pond. He challenged those around him to break free from the narrow confines of their own concerns and to see themselves as part of a larger, interconnected whole. And in doing so, he sparked something that would grow far beyond the limits of his own lifetime. Yet this is not just a story about a philosopher and his ideas. It is a story about you, the listener, and the world you inhabit today. For the questions Hierocles grappled with are the same questions we face now, in an age where the stakes are even higher. How far does our duty to others extend? Who belongs within our circle of concern? How do we live a good life in a world filled with uncertainty, conflict, and change? Through this audiobook, presented by Stoic Stories, all rights reserved, we will journey into the life and mind of Hierocles, discovering how his teachings on Stoic compassion offer profound lessons for us all. With powerful storytelling, we will uncover how a single idea, that of expanding our empathy and concern, can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities and even civilizations. Stay with us as we dive deeper into the heart of a philosophy that urges us to look beyond ourselves and see our connection to all of humanity. What you are about to hear is not just history. It is a guide for living wisely with courage, justice, and compassion in our own troubled times. Prepare to be challenged, to reflect, and perhaps to see the world in a new light. So, if you're ready to explore the power of Stoic teachings through the art of storytelling, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Seeds of Compassion. We do not choose our beginnings, but we shape what comes after. This was a thought that often echoed in the mind of young Hierocles as he wandered through the narrow streets of his hometown. Born into a modest family in the Greek city of Alexandria, he had always been aware of the invisible lines that separated people, the lines of wealth, status, power, and privilege. Yet even as a child, Hierocles found himself questioning these divisions. His father, a craftsman known for his skill in metalwork, taught him the value of hard work and resilience. "The world may bend you, but never let it break you," his father would say, his hands worn and scarred from years of labor. His mother, by contrast, was a woman of quiet wisdom and deep empathy. She was often found helping their neighbors, caring for the sick, and sharing what little they had. Young Hierocles watched these acts of kindness unfold daily, pondering the stark difference between his parents' world, filled with humility and compassion, and the harshness that often surrounded them. But it was one particular event that planted the seed of compassion deep within him, a seed that would grow into the philosophy that would later define his life. One winter evening, a beggar appeared at their door. He was an old man, shivering in the cold, with nothing but tattered clothes to shield him from the biting wind. Hierocles' father, ever pragmatic, was hesitant. "We have barely enough for ourselves," he muttered. "How can we feed another mouth?" But his mother, without a moment's pause, welcomed the man inside, offering him a warm meal and a place by the fire. Hierocles sat quietly, watching the scene unfold. The old man's hands trembled as he lifted the bowl of soup to his lips, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. For days, the boy could not forget the look on that man's face, nor the sense of calm that seemed to settle over their home that night. When he finally gathered the courage to ask his mother why she had given so freely when they had so little, she simply replied, "Compassion is not a matter of choice. It is a necessity. The heart does not divide. It only multiplies." These words took root in Hierocles' mind, shaping his thoughts in ways he could not yet understand. As he grew older, he began to seek answers beyond the teachings of his parents, turning to the great philosophers of his time. In Alexandria, a city of learning and debate, Hierocles was surrounded by scholars who argued about virtue, justice, and the nature of the good life. He absorbed the teachings of Plato and Aristotle, learned from the cynics who roamed the streets, and listened intently to the Stoics who spoke of virtue as the highest good. Yet something always seemed missing. Many of these philosophers spoke of virtue, of justice, and of living according to reason, but few spoke of compassion, the kind that transcended the barriers of self-interest. It was not until Hierocles encountered the teachings of Epictetus, a former slave-turned-Stoic philosopher, that he found the thread he had been searching for. Epictetus spoke of a simple but profound truth, that every person, no matter their status or station, was a citizen of the same world, a part of a greater whole. "Remember," Epictetus would say, "that you are a brother to all men and women, that you belong to the same city, the city of the universe." These words resonated deeply with Hierocles. For the first time, he saw a philosophy that acknowledged the interconnectedness of all people, a philosophy that did not stop at the individual, but extended outward to encompass all of humanity. From that point on, Hierocles devoted himself to the study of Stoicism, absorbing its principles and practices, but always through the lens of compassion. He began to see the Stoic virtues of wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance not as isolated ideals, but as parts of a greater framework, a framework that could guide one's actions toward a deeper sense of connectedness with others. Hierocles often found himself reflecting on Epictetus's teaching about the circles of concern. He imagined these circles starting from the self and expanding outward, first to one's family, then to friends, then to fellow citizens, and finally to all of humanity. He began to wonder, what if we could expand these circles even further? What if the circle never truly ended, but kept growing, kept widening, until it embraced all life, all beings? This vision consumed Hierocles. He saw it as a way to bridge the divide between the ideals of Stoicism and the reality of human experience. But he knew it would not be easy. To expand one's circle of concern was to challenge the very nature of human instinct, the tendency to protect oneself, to prioritize one's own over the other, to create boundaries where there need be none. Hierocles began to teach, first in small gatherings, then in larger assemblies, speaking to anyone who would listen. He spoke of the concentric circles of concern, and how we could each practice expanding our compassion step by step, starting with those closest to us and slowly moving outward. At first, his words were met with skepticism, even ridicule. "What foolishness," some would cry. "Compassion has no place in a world ruled by strength and power." But Hierocles was patient. He knew that seeds take time to grow. Gradually, he found those who were willing to listen, those who were moved by his vision of a world bound together by a common humanity. He taught them that to live by virtue was not only to be wise, courageous, and just, but also to be deeply connected to others, to see one's own welfare intertwined with the welfare of all. The city became his classroom, and his lessons were often subtle, found not just in words but in actions. He would be seen speaking kindly to a beggar, offering help to a struggling merchant, or pausing to listen to the troubles of a soldier weary from battle. These small, quiet acts spoke louder than any lecture. They were demonstrations of his belief that every human being, no matter how seemingly insignificant, was worthy of compassion and respect. As the years passed, his teachings began to spread. Slowly, they created a ripple effect, moving outward like the circles he so often described. Some came to him in secret, fearing the judgment of others but longing to learn. Others, inspired by his words, began to see their own lives and their relationships in a new light. The influence of Hierocles began to grow, not through conquest or command, but through the simple yet profound power of Stoic compassion. And so, the seeds of Hierocles' philosophy were sown. The question remained, would they take root and flourish in a world so often divided by fear and conflict? Could his vision of expanded compassion truly create a ripple effect that would spread beyond his time, beyond his city, and beyond the constraints of human nature itself? Only time would tell. Stay with us as we continue this journey into the life of Hierocles, a man whose quiet revolution of the heart dared to challenge the very foundations of his world. Chapter 2, The First Circle, Expanding Beyond the Self. To be kind is not to be weak. To reach beyond oneself is not to be reckless. These were the words that Hierocles often pondered as he began to truly grasp the profound implications of his newfound understanding of Stoic compassion. He realized that if one could learn to extend empathy and concern beyond the immediate circle of the self, a subtle but significant shift would occur in how one viewed the world and lived within it. Hierocles' first challenge was to expand this understanding in his own life. It is one thing to speak of compassion in the abstract, but quite another to practice it when faced with life's relentless difficulties. In his quiet moments, he would meditate on the teachings of the Stoics, reminding himself that virtue is the only true good, and that to live virtuously, one must always be prepared to act justly, wisely, and with temperance, no matter the circumstance. He began with the simplest, most immediate circle, himself. Stoicism taught that we must first master our own passions, our desires and our impulses, before we can hope to affect the world around us. So, he set about cultivating self-discipline. He woke each day at dawn, practiced restraint in his diet, and worked tirelessly on his studies. He embraced poverty and simplicity, rejecting material excess, and trained himself to find contentment in little. He learned to view setbacks as opportunities to practice patience and to see insults as a chance to cultivate humility. But Hierocles understood that self-mastery was just the beginning. The circle of concern could not end with the self, lest it become a philosophy of self-absorption. He knew that the next step was to expand his compassion to those immediately around him, his family and close friends. Yet, even this presented a challenge. His father, a pragmatic man, often ridiculed Hierocles' philosophical pursuits. "You speak of compassion and virtue," his father would say, "but these words will not feed us, nor will they repair the roof or mend the tools." His father's skepticism cut deep. Hierocles felt a pang of frustration, but he knew that this was an opportunity to practice what he preached. He did not react with anger or defensiveness. Instead, he listened, allowing his father to voice his concerns. One evening, after another heated argument about the futility of philosophy, Hierocles approached his father in the workshop. The older man was bent over his tools, sweat glistening on his brow. Instead of defending his beliefs, Hierocles quietly picked up a hammer and began working beside him. He spent hours helping his father repair what was broken, silently proving that philosophy did not make one indifferent to practical life, but rather enriched it. His father, though grumbling, was touched by his son's willingness to help, and a small, unspoken understanding began to grow between them. It was a start, the first tentative step toward expanding his circle of compassion. Hierocles also began to apply these principles to his friendships. One of his closest friends, Callimachus, was a fellow student who shared Hierocles' love of philosophy, but struggled with bouts of anger and frustration. Callimachus was often quick to temper, easily offended by others' words or actions, and frequently lashed out in arguments. Many around him, even other philosophers, saw him as a lost cause, a man whose nature was too unruly to be tempered by reason. But Hierocles saw something different. He saw a man who was suffering, a man who perhaps had never been shown true understanding or compassion. Instead of distancing himself, Hierocles drew closer. He listened patiently to Callimachus's rants, offering calm and reasoned responses. He never matched anger with anger, always choosing to meet his friend's outbursts with quiet composure. One afternoon, after a particularly heated debate in which Callimachus had insulted several members of their study group, Hierocles found his friend sitting alone by the river, clearly agitated. Rather than chastising him, Hierocles sat down beside him in silence, waiting until Callimachus was ready to speak. After a long pause, his friend finally spoke. "Why do you not abandon me like the others? Why do you persist in your calmness, even when I am so difficult?" Hierocles smiled gently. "Because, my friend, we are all difficult. We are all struggling with something. Anger is a wave on the surface. Beneath it is the stillness of the water. I see that stillness in you, and I believe you can find it yourself." This moment marked a turning point. Over time, Callimachus began to change. The outbursts became less frequent, his words more measured. He still struggled with his nature, but he knew he had a friend who believed in him, who saw the good beneath the rough exterior. Hierocles' compassion had begun to make a difference, not through force, but through patience and understanding. As Hierocles practiced these small acts of compassion, he started to notice a change within himself. His own spirit grew calmer, his purpose clearer. He saw that each step he took beyond his own narrow self-interest, each moment he spent attending to the needs and struggles of those around him, he felt a deeper sense of connection to others and to the world. This was the first circle expanding, the immediate circle of his family and friends. But Hierocles knew this was only the beginning. The circle must continue to grow. If his ideas were to have any real impact, they needed to extend beyond those he already knew and cared for, beyond the familiar and comfortable. The challenge ahead was far greater, to expand his compassion to the broader community, to those who were strangers, and even to those who might consider themselves his enemies. Hierocles began to seek out opportunities to connect with people from all walks of life. He spent time in the marketplace, not just as an observer, but as an active participant. He would engage in conversations with merchants, laborers, soldiers, and beggars, listening to their stories, understanding their hardships. He would offer help where he could, not out of pity, but from a place of genuine concern. To the skeptical onlooker, these acts might have seemed small and insignificant, but to Hierocles, they were profound steps in the journey of expanding the circle. He faced resistance, of course. There were those who viewed his ideas with suspicion, who saw his openness as a weakness or naivety. Why waste your time with those who are beneath you? They would ask. Why concern yourself with those who offer nothing in return? Hierocles would smile at such questions, knowing that these challenges were opportunities to further test his resolve and commitment to his principles. He realized that expanding the circle required courage, the courage to face misunderstanding, ridicule, and even hostility. But he also knew that this was the very essence of Stoicism. To act with virtue regardless of the cost, to pursue the good without expectation of reward, and to maintain one's inner peace amidst the turmoil of life. One day, as Hierocles was leaving the market, he came upon a scene that would further test his newfound commitment. A group of young men were taunting a disabled beggar, mocking his appearance and throwing small stones at him. The crowd around them looked away, too afraid or indifferent to intervene. Hierocles felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he quickly recalled the Stoic principle, that only our own actions and judgments are within our control. He walked calmly into the middle of the fray and placed himself between the men and the beggar. "Enough," he said, his voice steady but firm. The men hesitated, taken aback by his quiet authority. "This man has done you no harm. In mocking him, you only reveal your own weakness." One of the men, emboldened by the crowd, sneered, "And who are you to tell us what is right? A philosopher with words but no power?" Hierocles met his gaze evenly. "I am just a man like you, but I know that our strength does not come from demeaning others, but from showing kindness, even when it is difficult. Compassion is not a weakness. It is the greatest strength of all." The crowd murmured, sensing a shift in the air. The young men, unsure of how to respond, slowly backed away. Hierocles turned to the beggar and offered his hand, helping him to his feet. "Come," he said softly. "Let us find a place where you can rest." The beggar looked at him with a mixture of fear and gratitude, and the two of them walked away, leaving the crowd in stunned silence. This moment became a defining one for Hierocles. It demonstrated to others and to himself that expanding one's circle of compassion was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a call to action. It required courage, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to see the humanity in everyone. As Hierocles continued to practice these principles, he saw how each act, no matter how small, created ripples that extended far beyond the initial gesture. Slowly, others began to follow his example. A merchant offered food to a hungry child. A soldier shared his cloak with a shivering stranger. These acts were simple, yet they spoke of a deeper truth, that compassion, like a circle, is infinite in its potential to expand. But Hierocles knew there were still greater challenges to come. The real test would be in extending this philosophy even further, beyond the familiar streets of his city, beyond the known boundaries of his community, and into the broader, often hostile world. How far could one's compassion truly reach, and what might happen when it collided with the harsh realities of the world? The journey was only beginning, and Hierocles was prepared to face whatever lay ahead. For he knew that the greatest power lay not in strength or wealth, but in the courage to live by one's principles, to expand the circle, and to see every human being as part of a larger whole. Stay with us as we continue to follow the life of Hierocles and discover how his journey of expanding Stoic compassion unfolds in the face of ever greater challenges. Chapter 3. Beyond Familiar Boundaries. Compassion in the Community. The marketplace was alive with the sounds of trade, the clatter of carts, the laughter of children, the sharp cries of merchants extolling the virtues of their wares. For many, it was a place of commerce and daily survival, a space where every transaction was marked by negotiation and guarded caution. But for Hierocles, it had become something more, a testing ground for his expanding philosophy of Stoic compassion. Having established his first circle of concern, reaching out to family and friends, Hierocles knew that the next challenge was to extend his compassion beyond the familiar boundaries and into the wider community. He understood that true virtue required more than caring for those who were naturally close. It required reaching out to those who were strangers, those whom society often ignored or mistreated. But how could he move beyond his comfort zone and inspire others to do the same? One day, while visiting the market, Hierocles observed a common sight: a small group of street urchins, dirty and ragged, scavenging for scraps of food. Most people passed by with hurried steps, unwilling to acknowledge the children's presence, as if fearing that even a glance might invite trouble. To many, these children were an inconvenience, a problem that lay beyond their sphere of concern. Hierocles watched the scene carefully, feeling a deep pang of sympathy. He knew that these children, like all people, were part of the same concentric circles of concern he had been teaching about. Yet he also recognized that to extend compassion to them would not be easy. It would require a deliberate effort to break down the invisible walls that separated us from them. Hierocles approached the children slowly, not with pity, but with genuine curiosity and concern. He knelt down to their level, smiling kindly. "What are your names?" he asked gently. The children looked at him warily, their eyes filled with suspicion. They were used to being dismissed, shooed away, treated as nuisances. One of the older boys, perhaps emboldened by Hierocles' calm demeanor, replied, "I'm Petros, and these are my brothers, Nicias and Thalia. We've done nothing wrong, sir. We're just trying to find something to eat." Hierocles nodded, understanding their fear. "I am not here to scold you, Petros. I'm here to understand. Tell me, where do you sleep? How do you live?" Petros hesitated, but there was something in Hierocles' voice, a sincerity that seemed to cut through the usual veneer of distrust. "We sleep wherever we can find shelter," he said slowly. "Sometimes in the ruins, sometimes under the carts. We eat when we find food, and go hungry when we don't." Hierocles listened carefully, his heart aching for the plight of these children, but he knew that compassion required more than just feeling, it required action. He invited the children to sit with him in a quieter corner of the market, offering them some bread and water. As they ate, he spoke to them gently, asking about their lives, their dreams, their fears. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to break the ice. Slowly the children began to open up, sharing stories of lost parents, harsh winters, and the daily struggle to survive. A small crowd began to gather, curious about this man who chose to spend his time with beggars and orphans. Some watched with interest, others with disapproval. To many, Hierocles' actions seemed foolish. Why waste time on those who had nothing to offer in return? But Hierocles knew that this was precisely the point of his philosophy: to extend one's circle of concern, not based on what one could gain, but on the shared humanity that bound all people together. Hierocles decided to use this opportunity to teach a lesson, not only to the children, but also to those who had gathered around. He spoke softly, but his words carried weight. "These children," he began, "are part of our community, just as much as the merchants, the scholars, or the soldiers. They suffer as we suffer. They feel hunger as we feel hunger, and they are no less deserving of our care and compassion. To ignore them is to deny our own humanity, to fail to see the divine spark that lives within each of us." There was a murmur among the crowd, a mix of agreement and dissent. An elderly merchant, his face lined with years of experience, stepped forward. "You speak well, philosopher," he said, "but words will not feed these children, nor will they clothe them. Compassion is good in theory, but it is not practical in the hard world we live in." Hierocles smiled gently. "You are right," he replied. "Words alone are not enough, But compassion is not just a feeling. It is a practice, an action. It begins with small steps, sharing a meal, offering shelter, treating others with dignity. It may seem insignificant, but these acts create ripples, which spread and grow. To demonstrate his point, Hierocles reached into his own modest purse and gave what little money he had to the merchant, asking him to use it to buy bread and clothes for the children. Moved by this unexpected gesture, the merchant agreed, and soon others in the crowd began to offer small contributions. Some gave coins, others offered food or blankets. What began as a small gesture turned into a larger movement, as people who had previously ignored the children now began to see them with new eyes. Over the weeks that followed, Hierocles continued to frequent the marketplace, looking for opportunities to extend his philosophy of compassion into the wider community. He spoke to merchants and laborers, to soldiers and scholars, encouraging them to see beyond their own narrow interests and consider the welfare of others. He organized small gatherings where people could come together, share their experiences, and find common ground. Slowly but surely, his ideas began to take root. A merchant who once drove beggars away began to leave food outside his shop. A soldier who once turned a blind eye to the suffering of others began to offer his spare time to help those in need. But there were also those who resisted, who mocked Hierocles for his idealism and called his efforts naive. One day, a group of young men confronted him in the marketplace. "You are wasting your time, old man," they jeered. "This world is driven by power and wealth, not by your fanciful ideas of compassion. People are selfish by nature. You cannot change that." Hierocles met their taunts with calm resolve. "Perhaps you are right," he said. "Perhaps I am a fool to think that compassion can change the world. But I ask you this. Is it not better to try, to strive for something higher than to accept the world as it is? To live without trying to make a difference is to live without purpose. I would rather be a fool with hope than wise with despair." His words lingered in the air, challenging those who heard them to reconsider their assumptions. Slowly, one of the young men stepped forward, his expression softened. "Perhaps there is something in what you say, philosopher," he muttered. "I will think on it." It was a small victory, but one that gave Hierocles hope. He knew that change would not come quickly or easily. It would require patience, persistence, and the willingness to confront both external obstacles and internal doubts. But he also knew that each step, no matter how small, brought him closer to his goal. Over time, Hierocles' presence in the community began to have a noticeable impact. More people started to attend his gatherings, eager to hear his thoughts on Stoic compassion and how it could be applied to daily life. He taught them about the Stoic virtues, wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, and how these could be lived out through acts of kindness, generosity, and understanding. He shared stories of those who had embraced this philosophy, like the merchant who had once been indifferent to the suffering of others but had now become a quiet benefactor to the poor. He spoke of the soldier who, despite his hardened exterior, had found a new purpose in serving his fellow citizens with humility and compassion. Each story, each example, was a testament to the power of expanding one's circle of concern. But Hierocles knew there was still much work to be done. For every heart he reached, there were many more that remained closed. Many more who saw compassion as a weakness rather than a strength. The real test was yet to come, the test of whether these ideas could survive in the face of true adversity, whether they could withstand the harsh realities of a world that often seemed indifferent to suffering. One day, as Hierocles was walking through the city, he was approached by a group of citizens with worried faces. "Philosopher," they said, "we need your help. There is trouble brewing at the city gates. A band of refugees has arrived, fleeing from war, and the authorities are refusing to let them enter." They fear these strangers will bring disease or unrest. What should we do? Hierocles paused, feeling the weight of the situation. This was the true test of his philosophy. It was one thing to speak of compassion in theory, to practice it in small, controlled settings, but it was another to extend it in the face of real fear, real uncertainty, and real risk. He looked at the citizens around him, their faces filled with anxiety and doubt. "We must not turn them away," he said finally. "They are our fellow human beings, part of our circle of concern. If we deny them compassion, we deny our own humanity. But we must act wisely, with both courage and prudence." Chapter 4. A City Divided. The Refugee Crisis. The city gates were a scene of confusion and fear. Dozens of refugees, men, women, and children, stood clustered together, their clothes ragged, their faces marked by exhaustion and despair. They had fled from a distant war, seeking safety within the walls of a city that seemed indifferent to their plight. On the other side of the gate, a group of Roman guards stood firm, blocking their entry. Nearby, a crowd of citizens gathered, their voices raised in anxiety and anger. Tension hung heavy in the air like a storm waiting to break. Hierocles arrived at the gates just as the argument between the guards and the refugees' spokesperson reached a fever pitch. The captain of the guard, a stern-faced man named Marcus, shouted over the commotion, "We cannot let you enter. You may bring disease or trouble. We must protect the citizens of this city first." His voice was filled with authority, but also with the frustration of a man caught between duty and empathy. The refugees' spokesperson, an older woman with grey hair and a resolute gaze, responded with a calm dignity. "We come in peace," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We have lost everything. We seek only safety and shelter. Is there no room in your hearts for compassion?" Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting nervously between the woman and the crowd of onlookers, who were growing more restless by the moment. Some shouted in support of the guards, fearing that the arrival of refugees would bring disease or instability. Others, however, murmured in disagreement, their expressions conflicted. Hierocles could see both sides clearly. On one hand, he understood the fear that drove people to protect their own. On the other, he could not ignore the suffering of those who had come to their gates, seeking nothing more than refuge. He knew this moment was a test of his philosophy, a chance to show that Stoic compassion could rise above fear and division, and guide the city toward a wiser, more humane course of action. Stepping forward, Hierocles raised his hand to call for silence. His presence commanded attention, and gradually the crowd quieted. He turned first to Marcus, his voice calm but authoritative. "Captain," he began, "I understand your concerns. It is your duty to protect this city, and that is a duty we all respect. But tell me this. What is the nature of your protection if it costs us our humanity?" Marcus frowned, his brow furrowed. "Philosopher, you speak of ideals, but we live in the real world. We cannot risk the safety of our people on the basis of sentiment alone." Hierocles nodded. "Indeed, we must be prudent. But prudence and compassion are not enemies. They are allies. We must consider not only the immediate danger, but also the long-term effects of our actions. What kind of city do we wish to be? One that shuts its gates to those in need, or one that rises to meet the challenge with courage and kindness?" He then turned to the gathered citizens, addressing them directly. "Look at these people," he said, gesturing to the refugees. "They are not strangers. They are our brothers and sisters. Like us, they seek safety. They seek peace. We must not let fear blind us to our shared humanity. To live with virtue means to see beyond our narrow circle of concern and to act justly, even when it is difficult." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others crossed their arms, skepticism etched on their faces. Hierocles knew that words alone might not be enough to sway everyone. He needed to appeal to their sense of reason and practicality as much as to their compassion. He continued, "Think of the lessons we have learned from our past. When we act with selfishness, we sow seeds of discord and resentment. But when we extend our hand in friendship, we create bonds that strengthen us all. These people bring with them skills, knowledge, and potential. They are not a burden. They are an opportunity for our community to grow, to become greater than it was before." At this, an elderly man in the crowd, a respected merchant named Gaius, stepped forward. "Hierocles, you speak of compassion. But what if they bring disease, as the captain says? What if they take what little we have?" Hierocles turned to Gaius and replied, "Your concerns are valid, Gaius, and we must address them. We can take precautions. We can provide temporary shelter outside the walls while ensuring they are healthy. We can invite the refugees to contribute to the community in exchange for our hospitality. But we must not close our hearts. Fear must not guide our actions, for fear is the enemy of virtue." A silence fell over the crowd as the words sank in. Then, unexpectedly, a young woman stepped forward from the group of refugees. She was thin and frail, her face gaunt from hunger, but her eyes held a fierce determination. "I am Livia," she said, her voice quivering. "I was once a teacher in my city. I taught children to read, to think, to become more than they thought possible. We have much to offer, if only you will give us the chance." Her plea touched a nerve. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, and Hierocles seized the moment. "Livia speaks the truth," he said. "These people are more than their misfortune. They are our chance to practice the virtues we claim to hold dear. To be wise in our judgment, just in our actions, courageous in our decisions, and temperate in our fears. Let us meet this challenge as Stoics, not by retreating into fear, but by extending our circles of concern." For a moment no one spoke. Then slowly Gaius nodded. "I will contribute to help set up temporary shelters," he said. "But I insist that we do it with care, as Hierocles suggests." Marcus, the captain of the guard, looked conflicted but finally relented. "Very well," he said. "We will allow them to stay outside the walls for now, under observation. But if there is any sign of trouble, we will act swiftly." Hierocles smiled, grateful for the compromise. "This is a start," he said. "We have chosen not the easiest path, but the right one." Over the next days, Hierocles worked tirelessly to coordinate the efforts of the citizens, the guards, and the refugees. The temporary shelters were set up outside the city walls, and the refugees were given food and medical attention. Many of the refugees, true to Livia's words, began to contribute in small but meaningful ways, helping with repairs, teaching skills, sharing knowledge. The initial fear and suspicion slowly began to fade, replaced by a cautious hope. However, not everyone was pleased with this new arrangement. Some factions within the city still grumbled, viewing the refugees as a threat to their way of life. Whispers spread of discontent, of those who felt Hierocles had overstepped, who believed he was too idealistic, too naive. They spoke of a need to prioritize their own, to protect their resources, to maintain their order. One evening, as Hierocles was returning from the refugee camp, he was approached by a small group of city leaders. Their faces were serious, their tones stern. Hierocles, one of them, a man named Decimus, began, We respect your intentions, but we must think of the future. If we allow these refugees to stay, what message does that send? That anyone can come here and demand our resources? This is a dangerous precedent." Hierocles listened carefully, recognizing the genuine concern behind their words. "I understand your fears, Decimus," he replied, "but let us consider another perspective. What if, instead of fearing what they might take, we consider what they might bring? Strength comes not from isolation, but from integration. Compassion is not a sign of weakness, but of resilience." Decimus shook his head. "Perhaps," he said, "but compassion will not defend us if times grow hard. You ask us to open our hearts, but will you bear the blame if it leads to our ruin?" Hierocles met his gaze steadily. "I do not ask you to abandon caution," he replied. "I ask you to consider what kind of city we wish to be. A city that stands together, that supports its own by also supporting others, or a city that turns inward, blinded by fear, until it is hollow and brittle. The Stoics teach us to act according to virtue, to do what is right, not just what is easy or safe." The leaders seemed unconvinced, but Hierocles sensed a crack in their resolve. He knew it would take time and continued effort to win them over, to show them that Stoic compassion was not mere sentiment, but a practical guide for living with integrity and purpose. In the days that followed, Hierocles continued to work with both the refugees and the city's citizens, building trust, fostering dialogue, and slowly expanding the circle of concern. The process was not without setbacks or conflicts, but it was progress. Then, one morning, a new crisis struck. A child in the refugee camp fell ill with a fever, and panic spread quickly through both the camp and the city. Whispers of disease and contagion grew louder, and once more fear threatened to tear apart the fragile understanding that had been built. Hierocles knew that this was a critical moment. The trust he had worked so hard to build could be shattered in an instant. He hurried to the camp, speaking to the doctors, urging calm, ensuring that every possible precaution was taken. Then, Chapter 5, The Fever and the Fire, a Test of Virtue. The news spread like wildfire through the city. A child in the refugee camp had fallen ill, and some whispered that this was just the beginning. Fear rippled through the streets, growing stronger with each passing hour. Markets, once bustling, were now tense with worry. People spoke in hushed tones, casting suspicious glances toward the camp outside the city walls. The initial seeds of compassion that Hierocles had sown now seemed fragile, threatened by the storm of fear that loomed over the community. The child, a small boy with dark hair and a pallid face, lay in the arms of his mother, his body shivering uncontrollably. His mother, Livia, the same woman who had pleaded for their entry, now wore a look of desperate anxiety. Around her, the other refugees gathered, their faces marked by uncertainty. Hierocles stood among them, feeling the weight of their collective fear. The city's physician, a stern man named Galen, examined the boy carefully, his brows furrowed with concern. "It's a fever, but its cause is unclear," he said finally. "We need to isolate him from the others to prevent any potential spread." Livia's eyes filled with tears. "Please," she begged, "do whatever is necessary, but save my child." Hierocles turned to Galen. "Will isolating the boy suffice?" he asked calmly. "What more can we do to help him and to reassure the people of the city?" Galen hesitated. "Isolation is the first step," he said. "We must also monitor the other refugees closely for any signs of illness. The city is anxious, and with good reason. If this is something contagious, it could spread quickly." Hierocles nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Then we must act swiftly, with both wisdom and compassion," he replied. But we must not let fear drive us to cruelty or rashness. We owe it to ourselves to respond with reason and care. He spoke to the guards and volunteers at the camp, coordinating a plan to set up a quarantine area where the boy could be treated and monitored. Galen agreed to stay and provide medical care, along with a few other healers who volunteered to help. Hierocles knew that this decision carried risk, but he also knew that it was a necessary step to prevent panic and to protect both the refugees and the city's citizens. Back within the city walls, however, tensions were rising. The news of the child's illness had sparked a wave of fear that threatened to turn into hysteria. Some citizens demanded that the camp be disbanded and the refugees sent away. "We cannot risk an outbreak," they cried. "Better to be safe than sorry." Others, influenced by Hierocles' teachings, called for calm and reason. "We must trust the precautions," they argued. "We cannot abandon our humanity at the first sign of trouble." In the midst of this growing divide, Hierocles called for a public assembly in the agora, hoping to address the city directly. As he stood before the gathered crowd, he could feel the tension, the anger, and the fear. But he also sensed a willingness to listen, a glimmer of hope that reason might yet prevail. He began to speak, his voice steady and clear. "Citizens of Rome," he said, "I understand your fears. They are natural, and they are not without reason. But let us not be quick to abandon our principles. The Stoic way teaches us that it is not the events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. We must judge wisely." He paused, letting his words settle. "We have taken precautions. We have isolated the child, and we are providing care under the guidance of our physicians. We must remain vigilant, yes, but also compassionate. To send these people away now, in their hour of greatest need, would be to act from fear, not virtue." A voice shouted from the crowd, "But what if the sickness spreads? What if it is more dangerous than we know?" Hierocles nodded, acknowledging the concern. "Indeed, we must be cautious. But remember, fear is a fire that can consume us if left unchecked. We must balance our caution with courage, our reason with compassion. Fear can divide us, turn us against each other. But compassion, tempered with wisdom, can bring us together, strengthen us against adversity." A murmur of agreement ran through some parts of the crowd, while others remained unconvinced. Hierocles knew he had to offer more than just words. He needed to show that Stoic teachings could provide a practical path forward. He continued, "We have a choice before us, to close our hearts and our gates, or to face this challenge with strength of character. I ask you to remember that these refugees are our fellow human beings. They seek the same things we all seek: safety, hope, a chance to live. To turn them away now would not only condemn them, but also diminish our own humanity." A young woman in the crowd, whom Hierocles recognized as a shopkeeper named Marcia, raised her voice. "But what can we do?" she asked. "We are afraid, and we don't know what will happen." Hierocles smiled gently. "Fear is not a weakness, Marcia. It is a part of being human. But we must not let it control us. We can choose to act with courage. We can choose to support those who are suffering, to offer help rather than rejection. We can choose to face this crisis together rather than apart." Gradually, the mood in the agora began to shift. More citizens began to speak out in favor of a measured, compassionate response. Hierocles' words had struck a chord, reminding them of their shared values and the strength that lay in unity. But as the assembly dispersed, Hierocles knew the hardest part was yet to come. The illness needed to be contained, and trust needed to be maintained. He returned to the camp, where Galen and the other healers were working tirelessly to care for the sick child and to ensure the health of the others. Days passed in tense uncertainty. Each morning, Hierocles would visit the camp, speaking with the refugees, encouraging them to stay strong, to trust in the care they were receiving. He would then return to the city to reassure the citizens, to keep them informed, and to quell any rumors or fears that threatened to spread. Then, late one night, a messenger came running to Hierocles' home. "The fever has spread," he said breathlessly. "2 more children have fallen ill. The citizens are growing restless again. They fear an outbreak." Hierocles felt a knot tighten in his chest. This was the moment he had dreaded. He knew that if fear took hold now, all the progress they had made could unravel in an instant. He had to act quickly. He rushed to the camp, where he found Galen and the other healers working frantically. The 2 new cases were indeed concerning, but Galen remained calm. "It's still manageable," he assured Hierocles. "We've isolated them, and we're doing everything we can to treat them, but we need more supplies, and we need the city's support." Hierocles nodded. "I will speak to the people again. They must understand that panic will only make things worse. We must stay united." He returned to the city square at dawn, where a new crowd had already gathered, their faces marked by fear and uncertainty. Before he could speak, Decimus, the city leader who had previously challenged him, stepped forward. "Hierocles," he said loudly, "you asked us to trust in compassion and wisdom, but now the illness is spreading. How can we trust that your way will protect us?" Hierocles met his gaze steadily. "Decimus, I do not ask for blind trust. I ask for courage and reason. We must face this crisis not with panic, but with clear minds and open hearts. The sickness may spread, yes, but we are prepared to fight it. We must be vigilant, but also compassionate. This is a test of our character as much as our resolve." Decimus hesitated, clearly torn between his fear and the sense of duty that Hierocles had invoked. "And if more fall ill," he pressed. "Then we will face it together," Hierocles replied. "We will not abandon our principles. We will do what is necessary to protect our people, but we will not surrender to fear. We will act wisely, carefully, but always with a sense of our shared humanity." A moment of silence followed. Then a voice from the crowd, Marcia the shopkeeper, spoke up again. "I will donate some of my stock of herbs and supplies," she offered. "Let's help the healers in their work." Another voice chimed in. "I will offer my cart to transport the supplies." And then another. "I will volunteer at the camp to help the refugees and the healers." Gradually, one by one, more citizens began to offer their support, small gestures of solidarity that slowly built into a collective effort. Decimus, seeing the tide turning, sighed deeply and nodded. "Very well, Hierocles. We will try it your way for now." Hierocles thanked them, knowing that this fragile alliance depended on the days to come. The fever was still a threat, and any new case could rekindle the fires of fear. But he also saw that the community was beginning to understand something vital, that compassion, when tempered with wisdom and courage, was not a weakness, but a strength. It was the bond that could hold them together through the storm. Over the following days, the city rallied around the camp. Supplies were gathered, and volunteers worked tirelessly alongside the healers. The fever still loomed, but the panic began to subside as the community saw the care and diligence being applied, and slowly, hope began to return. One morning, as Hierocles walked through the camp, Galen approached him, a look of cautious optimism on his face. "The boy," he said. "His fever has broken, he is recovering, and the other children are stable." Hierocles felt a surge of relief. "This is good news," he said, smiling, "but we must remain vigilant. Let's continue our efforts until we are sure the danger has passed." He returned to the city, gathering the people once more in the agora. "Citizens," he announced, "the child's fever has broken, and the others are stable. Your courage, your patience, your compassion, they have made this possible. We have faced fear together, and we have not let it divide us." The crowd cheered, their spirits lifting with the good news. But Hierocles knew that this was not the end. The fever might still flare up again. There would be other challenges ahead. Yet, for the first time, he felt a sense of real progress. The city had faced a moment of crisis, and they had chosen a path of courage and compassion. As the sun set over the city, Hierocles reflected on the events of the past days. He knew that this was only one victory in a much larger battle, a battle against fear, against division, against the darker instincts that lurked in every human heart. But it was a start, and he was prepared for whatever came next. For he believed, now more than ever, that the concentric circles of concern could continue to grow, if only they had the courage to keep expanding them. He had seen the strength of a community united by compassion, and he knew that this was the path forward, not just for the city, but for humanity itself. Stay with us as we follow Hierocles on his journey to further expand the circles of Stoic compassion in the face of even greater trials. Chapter 6. The Stranger Within. Confronting Inner Conflict. The fever had been a test of the city's resolve, and though the worst seemed to be over, Hierocles knew that the real challenge lay ahead. The initial wave of relief that had swept through the community following the child's recovery was slowly giving way to deeper, quieter tensions. The refugees were still at the gates, and the city remained divided over their presence. Compassion had won a small victory, but it had not yet fully conquered the fears that lay hidden in people's hearts. Hierocles sensed the subtle shift in the air as he walked through the agora, greeting those he had come to know so well. He could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the unspoken questions that lingered just beneath the surface. How long would the refugees stay? Would there be another outbreak? Were they safe from harm? These doubts gnawed at the edges of the community's fragile peace. One morning, as Hierocles prepared to head to the refugee camp, he was approached by Marcia, the young shopkeeper who had stood up for compassion during the fever crisis. She looked troubled, her brow furrowed with worry. "Hierocles," she began hesitantly, "I am concerned, not for myself, but for the city. I hear whispers, rumors that some of the refugees are not who they claim to be. People are saying that there are spies among them, sent by enemies who wish to undermine us. I do not know what to believe, but fear is growing again." Hierocles listened intently, sensing that this was more than just idle gossip. He knew how easily suspicion could fester, how quickly fear could spread like a new kind of fever, infecting even those with the best intentions. "Rumors are like wildfires," he replied. "They thrive on uncertainty and consume the truth. We must be careful not to let them take root in our minds. But we must also be vigilant. I will speak with the leaders of the refugees and try to understand these concerns." Marcia nodded, looking relieved but still uneasy. "I trust your judgment, Hierocles," she said, "but I fear that others may not be so patient." Hierocles thanked her and continued on his way, pondering the delicate balance he had to maintain. He knew that fostering compassion was not simply about feeling sympathy. It was about navigating the complex interplay of fear, trust, and human nature. He arrived at the refugee camp, where Livia, the refugee leader, greeted him warmly. "Hierocles," she said, "we owe you much. The people here speak of your kindness, of your efforts to bring peace between us and the citizens. But I sense that trouble is brewing again. I have heard whispers, too, that we are being watched with suspicion." Hierocles nodded, confirming her fears. "Yes, there are rumors that some among you may not be who they claim to be. I do not believe them myself, but we must address them openly if we are to prevent mistrust from spreading further." Livia sighed deeply, her eyes filled with concern. I assure you, Hierocles, that we have nothing to hide. We are simple people, seeking refuge from war and hardship. But I understand the fears of the citizens. We would do the same if we were in their position. What can we do to ease their minds? Hierocles thought for a moment. Perhaps, he suggested, it would help if some of your people volunteered to work more closely with the citizens, to show them who you truly are. Acts of service often speak louder than words. We could organize joint efforts to repair the city's walls, clean the streets, or help in the fields. It would be a way to build trust, to break down the invisible walls that divide us. Livia nodded. That is a wise idea. I will speak to the others and see who is willing to help. We have many among us who are skilled in various trades. We wish to prove that we are not a burden, but an asset. The plan was set in motion, and within days, small groups of refugees began working alongside the citizens on various projects. A mason from the refugees taught his craft to local laborers, a healer tended to the sick in the poorer districts, and a former soldier offered to train the city's guards in new techniques he had learned. Slowly, the efforts began to have an effect. Those who had once been wary started to see the refugees in a new light, not as outsiders, but as fellow contributors to the community's well-being. But despite these positive steps, the rumors continued to swirl, fueled by a few voices who remained deeply suspicious. Decimus, the city leader who had previously questioned Hierocles, approached him one evening as he walked through the agora. "Hierocles," Decimus began, "I see what you are trying to do, and I respect your efforts, but I still have concerns. There are reports of a man among the refugees who was seen near the military barracks, asking questions. Some say he is a spy, sent to gather information on our defenses." Hierocles frowned. "Do you have any proof of this, Decimus, or is it just another rumor?" Decimus shrugged. "I have no proof, but people are afraid. They demand answers, and they look to me for leadership. I cannot simply dismiss their fears." Hierocles nodded, understanding the delicate position Decimus was in. "I will investigate this myself," he promised. "If there is a threat, we must address it. But we must also be careful not to let fear cloud our judgment. Fear is a shadow that can hide the truth as easily as it reveals it." He set out to find the man in question, asking discreetly among the refugees. Eventually, he was directed to a quiet figure sitting alone near the edge of the camp. The man was older, with a face marked by lines of hardship and a gaze that seemed both wary and tired. Hierocles approached him calmly and sat down beside him. "Peace to you, friend," Hierocles began. "I am Hierocles, a philosopher and a friend to those who seek refuge here. May I speak with you?" The man looked up, surprised but not hostile. "I know who you are," he replied. "They call me Leonidas. What do you wish to speak about?" "There are concerns," Hierocles said carefully, "that you have been seen near the military barracks asking questions. Some fear that you may have intentions that are less than honest." Leonidas sighed and shook his head. "I see how it is," he muttered. "Because I am a stranger, I am to be feared. Yes, because I ask questions, I must be a spy." Hierocles raised a hand, trying to calm him. "I do not accuse you, Leonidas. I simply seek to understand. The people are afraid, and fear breeds suspicion. If there is an explanation, it would help to clear the air." Leonidas hesitated for a moment, then spoke quietly. "I am not a spy, Hierocles. I am a father searching for his son. My son was conscripted into the army of the city from which we fled. I heard rumors that he may have been captured and brought here to Rome. I have been asking about him, hoping to find some trace of him." Hierocles felt a pang of compassion. "I see," he said softly. "And did you find any news of your son?" Leonidas shook his head, his eyes filled with sorrow. "No, only more questions. I fear he may be lost, but I cannot rest until I know for certain. Is that so wrong?" Hierocles placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "No, it is not wrong. It is only human. I will speak to the city leaders on your behalf to clear your name and put an end to these rumors. But I must ask you to be cautious in your inquiries. People are on edge, and any perceived threat, however unintentional, can stir fear." Leonidas nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Hierocles. I do not wish to cause trouble. I only wish to find my son." Hierocles returned to the city and sought out Decimus. "I have spoken with the man you mentioned," he reported. "He is not a spy. He is a father searching for his son, who may have been captured during the conflict. His intentions are not malicious." Decimus listened, but remained skeptical. "How can we be sure?" he asked. "People are still fearful." "We can be sure by continuing to build trust," Hierocles replied firmly. "Let him ask his questions, but under supervision if needed. Let us show that we are willing to understand before we accuse. This is what it means to live by Stoic principles, to act not on suspicion, but on reason, to judge others with fairness and empathy." Decimus nodded slowly, reluctantly agreeing. "Very well," he said, "but I will hold you responsible, Hierocles, if this trust is betrayed." Hierocles accepted the challenge. "I understand, Decimus. But remember, true virtue is tested not in comfort, but in conflict. We must be willing to risk trust if we are to build a community worth living in." Over the next weeks, Hierocles continued his efforts to strengthen the bonds between the refugees and the citizens. He organized shared meals, where both groups could come together and learn about each other's cultures and stories. He encouraged open dialogue, urging people to express their fears and concerns openly rather than letting them fester in the dark corners of their minds. Little by little, barriers began to break down. A soldier who had once eyed the refugees with suspicion began to teach them the local dialect. A group of women from the city offered to help the refugee children learn to read and write. Acts of kindness grew, like small seeds taking root in fertile soil. But Hierocles knew that the real battle was not just against external forces, but against the inner conflicts that each person carried within them. He spent long hours meditating on his own fears, his own doubts. He wondered if he had the strength to continue this work, if his philosophy could truly hold up against the relentless tide of human suspicion and division. One night, as he sat alone in his small home, he found himself reflecting on a passage from Epictetus. "It is not events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." He realized that his greatest challenge was not just to teach others about expanding their circles of concern, but to confront his own limitations, his own judgments. He felt a momentary wave of doubt wash over him. Was he truly making a difference, or was he simply a fool who believed that philosophy could change the world? The voices of his critics echoed in his mind, whispering that he was naive, that his ideals were too lofty for a world as harsh as this. But then he thought of Leonidas, of Livia, of Marcia, and the many others who had begun to find common ground through compassion and courage. He thought of the child whose fever had broken, the shared meals, the acts of kindness. And he realized that the journey was not about achieving perfection, but about striving continually toward the good, about expanding the circle little by little, step by step. With renewed resolve, he whispered to himself, "The only true failure is to stop trying." And with that thought, he closed his eyes, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Stay with us as we continue to explore Hierocles' journey, where inner conflicts meet external challenges and the true strength of Stoic compassion is put to the ultimate test. Chapter 7. The Challenge of Justice. Confronting the Unseen Enemy. Days turned into weeks, and the city seemed to settle into a tentative peace. The fever had passed, and the joint efforts between the refugees and the citizens were bearing fruit. The camp outside the city walls had transformed from a place of fear and suspicion to a community of its own, where shared work and dialogue began to weave a fragile but genuine bond of trust. Yet beneath this calm surface, a new tension was brewing. Hierocles sensed it in the whispers that passed through the market, in the uneasy glances exchanged between citizens, and in the guarded expressions of the refugees. There were still those who resisted the idea of integration, who clung to their fears and prejudices, and who whispered of hidden threats lurking among the newcomers. One morning, as Hierocles made his way through the agora, he was approached by Gaius, the elderly merchant who had initially been skeptical of the refugees. His face was grave, his voice low. "Hierocles," he began, "there's been an incident. A caravan of goods was robbed last night near the refugee camp. Some are saying it was the refugees. There's anger, and people are demanding justice." Hierocles felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He knew how quickly such accusations could spiral out of control. "Are there any witnesses, any proof?" he asked. Gaius shook his head. "None, just rumors and suspicions. But you know how it is. People are looking for someone to blame." Hierocles nodded. "Yes, I do. Thank you, Gaius, for telling me. I will look into this immediately." He made his way to the refugee camp, where a small crowd had already gathered, their faces anxious and defensive. Livia stepped forward, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "Hierocles," she said, "we have heard the accusations. I swear to you, we had nothing to do with this. My people are scared. They fear retaliation." Hierocles raised a hand to calm her. "I believe you, Livia," he said gently. "But we must address this openly and fairly. If we do not, suspicion will only grow, and with it, anger. Let us work together to find the truth." He turned to the gathered refugees. "If any of you have seen or heard anything, now is the time to speak. We must show the city that we have nothing to hide, that we are willing to cooperate to find the real culprits." For a moment there was silence. Then a young refugee named Elian stepped forward, his face tense. "I saw some men near the camp last night," he said. "They were not from here, but they seemed to be watching us closely. I did not think much of it at the time, but now I wonder if they were the ones who committed the crime and tried to blame us." Hierocles listened carefully. "Did you recognize any of them?" he asked. Elian shook his head. "No, it was dark, and they kept to the shadows. But I saw one of them drop something, a small pouch. I picked it up, thinking it might belong to someone here. It had a strange mark on it." He handed the pouch to Hierocles, who examined it closely. The pouch was made of fine leather, far too luxurious to belong to any of the refugees. It bore a distinctive seal, a symbol that Hierocles recognized as the mark of a local trade guild, one known for its wealth and influence in the city. Hierocles turned to Livia. "This may be a clue," he said. "I will take this to the city leaders and ask them to investigate. If these men were from the guild, then we may find answers there." Livia nodded, relieved. "Thank you, Hierocles. We trust you to find the truth." With the pouch in hand, Hierocles made his way back into the city, seeking out Decimus and the other leaders. They were gathered in a small council chamber, their faces tense with concern. "Hierocles," Decimus greeted him, "we were just discussing the robbery. The people are restless. They demand swift action." "I understand," Hierocles replied, "but we must be careful not to act on mere suspicion. I have spoken to the refugees, and one of them found this pouch near the scene of the crime. He placed the pouch on the table before them. "It bears the mark of a local trade guild. We should investigate this lead before making any accusations." Decimus picked up the pouch and examined it. "This is a significant clue," he admitted. "But it does not prove who committed the crime. It could have been stolen by anyone." Hierocles nodded. "That is true, but it is a starting point. We must seek the truth with patience and fairness. If we act hastily, we risk condemning the innocent and creating further divisions." The other leaders murmured in agreement, though some still seemed uneasy. Decimus finally sighed. "Very well, Hierocles," he said. "We will investigate this lead, but we cannot ignore the concerns of the people. If there is no evidence to clear the refugees, we may have to take measures to protect the city." Hierocles agreed to this compromise, though he knew it was a delicate balance. He left the council chamber and made his way to the guild hall, where he hoped to find more answers. The hall was a grand building, its walls adorned with tapestries and symbols of wealth. He was met at the door by a man named Lucius, the head of the guild, a shrewd and calculating figure known for his sharp business acumen. "Hierocles," Lucius greeted him with a forced smile, "to what do I owe the pleasure of your visit?" "I come seeking information," Hierocles replied calmly. "A caravan was robbed last night near the refugee camp. I found this pouch at the scene, bearing your guild's mark. I need to know if you have any knowledge of this." Lucius's eyes narrowed slightly. "A robbery, you say? And this pouch? Yes, it is ours. But how it came to be near the camp I cannot say. We have had no dealings with the refugees." Hierocles studied Lucius's face carefully. "Are you certain? Could any of your men have been near the camp last night?" Lucius hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying, "None that I know of, but I will look into it, of course. The guild has nothing to hide." Hierocles nodded, sensing that there was more to the story. "I hope you will," he said, "for the sake of justice, and for the peace of our city." He left the guild hall, his mind racing. Something about Lucius's demeanor seemed off, as if he were hiding something. Hierocles decided to dig deeper. Over the next few days, he spoke discreetly to those who had dealings with the guild, piecing together fragments of information. He learned that the guild had recently lost a lucrative contract to another group, a loss that had caused tension and resentment among its members. As he continued his inquiries, Hierocles was approached by a young guild apprentice, a nervous boy named Marcus. "Sir," the boy whispered, I have something to tell you. I heard some men from the guild talking last night. They were angry about the lost contract, and I heard them say they would teach a lesson to those who had taken it from them." Hierocles felt a surge of understanding. "Do you think these men might have been involved in the robbery?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "I do not know for sure, but it sounded like they were planning something. I was too afraid to ask more." Hierocles thanked the boy and returned to the city leaders with this new information. "I believe the guild may have been involved in the robbery," he told them. "They have a motive, the lost contract, and there is evidence that some of their men were planning retaliation. We should question them further." Decimus looked troubled. "If this is true, it changes everything, but accusing the guild without solid proof could lead to conflict. They are powerful and well-connected." Hierocles agreed. "That is why we must proceed carefully, with both courage and justice. We cannot allow fear or influence to cloud our judgment. We owe it to the refugees and to ourselves to seek the truth." The city leaders agreed to bring Lucius in for questioning. Under pressure, Lucius finally admitted that some of his men had acted without his knowledge, seeking to frame the refugees for the robbery in retaliation for the lost contract. They were angry, he confessed, and they thought they could divert suspicion away from themselves by blaming the newcomers. I did not authorize it, but I did not stop it either. The truth was out, and the city breathed a collective sigh of relief. The real culprits were exposed, and the refugees were cleared of any wrongdoing. Hierocles felt a wave of gratitude, but also a renewed understanding of the complexities of justice. He knew that true justice required more than just punishment. It required understanding the deeper causes of conflict, addressing the roots of fear and resentment, and finding a way to heal the wounds that divided people. As the sun set over the city, Hierocles addressed a gathering of citizens and refugees. "Today, we have seen the power of truth," he said. "We have seen that justice is not simply about finding the guilty, but about seeking the whole truth with patience and fairness. We have learned that fear can cloud our judgment, that prejudice can lead us astray, but also that compassion and reason can guide us back to the right path." He paused, looking out over the crowd. "We must continue to expand our circles of concern, to challenge our assumptions, to face our fears with courage, and to act with justice in all things. This is the Stoic way, the way that leads to a stronger, more unified community." The crowd cheered, their faith in Hierocles renewed. Yet Hierocles knew that this was but one battle in a much larger struggle. As he walked back to his home, he reflected on the days ahead. There would be more challenges, more fears to confront, more conflicts to resolve. But he was ready, for he knew that each step on this path, each test of virtue, brought them closer to a world guided by the principles of Stoic compassion. Stay with us as we continue to follow Hierocles on his journey, where the challenges grow ever more complex and the lessons of Stoicism find deeper and deeper meaning. Chapter 8. The Weight of Leadership. A City Under Siege. The victory of justice brought a brief calm to the city, but the calm soon proved to be the stillness before a storm. Hierocles sensed an uneasy tension in the air, a feeling that the peace they had fought so hard to preserve was fragile, precarious, and perhaps temporary. He felt the weight of leadership bearing down on him more heavily than ever. As the days passed, a new threat emerged, one far beyond the city's gates. Rumors began to spread of a raiding army moving closer to Rome, a group of marauders who had already pillaged nearby villages and left a trail of destruction in their wake. The city's scouts reported sightings of their advance, moving slowly but steadily toward the city. The news spread quickly, and fear gripped the hearts of the people once more. At a hastily convened council meeting, Decimus stood before the city's leaders, his face grim. "These raiders," he began, "are well-armed and ruthless. They will not negotiate. They will not show mercy. We must prepare for a siege. We must protect our walls and secure our people." The room buzzed with anxiety. Many of the leaders nodded in agreement, their expressions tense. "We must close the gates and fortify the defenses," one of them declared. "No one in or out until this threat has passed." Hierocles listened carefully, knowing the wisdom of preparing for defense, but he also recognized the danger of panic taking hold. He raised his voice calmly. "We must indeed prepare, but let us do so with clear minds and steady hearts. Fear can drive us to rash decisions. We must act with both courage and prudence." Decimus turned to him, eyes narrow. "Courage alone will not hold our walls, Hierocles. These raiders are dangerous. We cannot take any risks. What do you propose?" Hierocles met his gaze. "I agree we should fortify the city and prepare for the worst. But we must also think of those outside our walls, the refugees who sought our protection, the nearby villages that may still need our help. We must not abandon them." A murmur spread through the room. One leader, a seasoned soldier named Valerius, spoke up. "I respect your compassion, Hierocles, but we cannot defend everyone. Our resources are limited, and our first duty is to the people within these walls." Hierocles nodded. "I understand, Valerius, but we must also consider the long term. If we close our gates and turn away those in need, we risk becoming isolated, cut off from the support of others. Compassion, tempered with wisdom, can be our strength. We should send scouts to the surrounding villages, offer them refuge within our walls, and create alliances that might strengthen our defense." Decimus sighed. "Your idealism is commendable, Hierocles, but idealism will not protect us from swords and arrows. We must act decisively. We cannot risk our city for the sake of strangers." Hierocles felt the tension in the room rise. He knew he had to tread carefully. "I do not ask us to risk our safety," he replied, "but to consider a balanced approach. We can prepare for a siege while also extending a hand to those who might become our allies. Fear may cause us to close our doors, but wisdom urges us to keep them open just a crack." After much debate, the council reached a compromise. The city gates would remain closed and fortified, but scouts would be sent to the nearby villages to offer refuge and to assess the strength of the advancing raiders. Decimus, though reluctant, agreed to the plan. "We will see if your compassion brings us strength or weakness," he warned. In the days that followed, Hierocles took on the role of both philosopher and leader, working tirelessly to keep the city's spirit from breaking under the weight of impending danger. He spoke to the guards and soldiers, reminding them of their duty, encouraging them to find courage not just in their swords, but in their hearts. He visited the refugee camp and spoke with Livia, asking her to prepare her people for whatever might come. "We must stay strong," he told her. "There is much uncertainty ahead, but I believe we can face it together. Your people are a part of this city now. We will defend each other." Livia nodded, her eyes resolute. "We are grateful, Hierocles. We will do our part. We know what it means to face hardship, to stand together in the face of fear." Meanwhile, Hierocles continued to meditate on the Stoic teachings that had guided him so far. He recalled the words of Marcus Aurelius. "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." He knew that this crisis was not just a test of the city's defenses, but a test of its moral fiber, its ability to live by the principles of Stoic compassion and justice. A few days later, the scouts returned with troubling news. The raiders were closer than expected, moving swiftly, and were more numerous than originally thought. The villages nearby were already in chaos, many of their people fleeing toward Rome for safety. The threat was real, immediate, and growing. The city's leaders convened once more, their expressions grave. Decimus spoke first. "The time for discussion is over," he declared. "We must close the gates now before it is too late." Hierocles felt a surge of concern. "What of those who are fleeing here for safety?" he asked. "If we close the gates, we condemn them to death." Valerius, the soldier, responded, "And if we leave the gates open, we risk letting the enemy inside. We cannot protect everyone. Hierocles, we must protect ourselves." Hierocles took a deep breath. "I understand the risk, but if we turn our backs on those who seek our help, we risk losing our own humanity. Let us allow the refugees in, but in an organized way, one that ensures our security. We can vet them, ensure they pose no threat, and bring them in under guard. This way, we do not sacrifice compassion for caution." Decimus shook his head. "You gamble with our lives, Hierocles. But we have little time. We will try it your way, but you will be responsible for the consequences." Hierocles nodded, accepting the challenge. "I will take that responsibility," he said firmly. "Let us act quickly, with both courage and care." As the gates were partially opened, a stream of desperate people began to arrive, villagers, farmers, families with children, all fleeing from the oncoming threat. The guards walked quickly to vet them, checking for any signs of danger. It was a tense process, but it allowed the city to welcome those in need while maintaining a level of security. For a few days, the plan seemed to work. The gates remained under guard, the refugees were given shelter, and the city prepared itself for the coming siege. Hierocles continued to speak with the citizens, urging them to remain calm, to trust in their preparations, and to find strength in their unity. But just as hope began to grow, a new crisis emerged. A small group of raiders, disguised as refugees, managed to slip past the guards and enter the city. Under cover of darkness, they began setting fires in key locations, hoping to sow chaos and panic. The alarm was raised, and the city erupted into confusion. People ran through the streets, shouting and searching for safety. The guards rushed to put out the fires and capture the infiltrators, while citizens and refugees alike watched in horror, wondering if the city was about to fall. Hierocles sprang into action, moving swiftly through the city, shouting orders to the guards and rallying the people. "Stay calm," he called out. "Do not let fear control you. We will put out the fires and capture those responsible. Stand together, and we will overcome this." The guards, inspired by his calm authority, managed to capture the riders before they could cause more damage. The fires were extinguished, and order was restored, but the damage had been done. The citizens were shaken, their trust in Hierocles' approach severely tested. The next morning, a tense council meeting was held. Decimus was livid. "Your compassion has brought this upon us," he shouted. "You allowed the enemy inside our walls, and now we are weaker because of it." Hierocles met his anger with quiet resolve. The raiders used deceit, yes, but they did not defeat us. We acted with courage and saved many lives. We must not let this setback drive us to abandon our principles. Fear is what the enemy wants. They want us to turn on each other, to close ourselves off. Valerius added, "But we must also learn from this. We were too trusting, and we paid the price." Hierocles nodded. "We must indeed be more vigilant. I do not deny that mistakes were made, but we must not let fear make us forget our humanity. Let us learn from this and strengthen our defenses, but also remember why we fight, not just for our lives, but for our values." The council was divided, but reluctantly agreed to tighten security and continue preparing for the siege. However, trust in Hierocles had been shaken, and he knew that he would have to work even harder to maintain the city's fragile unity. As he walked through the streets, he could feel the eyes of the people on him, some filled with gratitude, others with doubt. He visited the refugee camp, where Livia met him with a concerned look. "Hierocles," she said quietly, "some of my people fear that they will be blamed for what happened. They worry that they will be turned away, or worse." Hierocles placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I will not let that happen, Livia. I promise you. We must stay strong, together. This is not the time to divide ourselves." That evening, he gathered the people of the city, citizens and refugees alike, for a public address in the agora. He stood before them, his face resolute, his voice calm but firm. "We have faced a great test," he began, "and we have made mistakes. But we have also shown courage, and we have stood together in the face of fear. The enemy seeks to divide us, to turn us against one another, but we will not let them succeed. We will stand united with wisdom and strength." He paused, looking out over the gathered faces. "We fight not just to survive, but to protect what is good and just within us. Let us not abandon our values in the face of fear. Let us remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly despite it. His words resonated with many, though doubt remained. The coming days would be crucial. Hierocles knew that the city was on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one moment of panic, could undo everything they had built. As he prepared for what lay ahead, he took a deep breath and remembered the Stoic teachings that had always guided him. To focus on what is within one's control, to act with virtue regardless of the outcome, and to trust that right action would lead to the best possible result, even if it was not always clear at first. He whispered to himself, "This is the true test of Stoic compassion, to hold firm in the face of fear, to stay true to one's principles, and to lead with both wisdom and courage." Stay with us as Hierocles faces the greatest challenge yet. A city on the brink, a people divided, and the search for strength in unity under siege. Chapter 9. The siege begins. The power of resilience. The distant thunder of drums echoed through the valley, and soon the first shadows of the raiders appeared on the horizon. The city of Rome, usually so full of life and vibrancy, now felt cloaked in a tense, waiting silence. The raiders had arrived, and the siege was about to begin. The citizens and refugees alike gathered on the walls, their faces set with determination and fear. Hierocles stood among them, his expression calm yet alert. He watched as the enemy forces moved into position, setting up camp just out of range of the city's archers. Their numbers were significant, far more than initially expected, and they were well armed. The raiders were not a mere band of marauders, they were a disciplined force prepared for a prolonged siege. Hierocles turned to Valerius, the seasoned soldier who had taken command of the city's defenses. "How do we stand, Valerius?" he asked. Valerius grimaced. "We are prepared as best we can be, Hierocles. The walls are strong, and we have enough supplies to last several weeks, but their numbers are greater than we thought. They are testing our resolve." Hierocles nodded, feeling the gravity of the situation. "And our people? Are they holding steady?" Valerius gave a weary nod. "For now. But fear is a powerful enemy. It seeps into the cracks, especially when we are isolated and under threat." Hierocles understood. He had spent his life studying the human soul, and he knew that fear could erode the strongest of hearts if left unchecked. "We must keep them focused," he said. "We must remind them of why we stand here, of what we protect." He moved to the edge of the wall, raising his voice so that all could hear. "Citizens of Rome," he called out, his voice carrying over the battlements, "look out at those who stand against us. They think they can break us with their numbers, their threats, but they do not know who we are. They do not know that we stand not just for ourselves, but for each other, for our values, for the principles that make us human." He paused, letting his words settle in. "This siege is a test, not just of our strength, but of our spirit. We have endured hardship before, and we will endure this as well. Together, we are stronger than any army, stronger than any fear. Let us hold our ground with courage and unity, for that is our greatest weapon." The crowd responded with a low murmur of agreement, a shared sense of resolve. Hierocles could see that they were scared, but his words had touched something deeper within them. He knew that words alone would not be enough, actions would have to follow, but for now he had given them a reason to stand firm. Over the next few days, the raiders probed the city's defenses, testing the walls, searching for weaknesses. They launched small skirmishes, but the city's guards held strong, repelling each attack with determination. Hierocles moved among the defenders, offering words of encouragement, reminding them of their duty, their strength, and the principles they defended. But as the days turned into weeks, the siege began to take its toll. Supplies grew scarcer, tempers grew shorter, and the strain of constant vigilance weighed heavily on everyone. The raiders, sensing the city's exhaustion, intensified their efforts, launching more frequent attacks, probing the walls for any sign of weakness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the raiders made their most daring move yet. Under cover of darkness, they sent a group of their best men to scale the western wall, hoping to infiltrate the city and open the gates from within. The alarm was raised, and chaos erupted. Hierocles, who had been meditating in his quarters, was jolted from his thoughts by the sound of shouting. He grabbed a sword, though he was no warrior, and rushed to the western wall, where the fighting was fiercest. He saw Valerius and his men struggling to hold the line as the raiders fought with brutal intensity. Without hesitation, Hierocles leapt into the fray, wielding his sword with more courage than skill. He was no match for the trained raiders, but he fought with a fierce determination, using every ounce of strength to protect his people. His presence on the battlefield, though unexpected, inspired the defenders to push harder to hold their ground.
Valerius, seeing Hierocles fighting beside him, shouted, "Philosopher, you are needed elsewhere. This is not your place."
Hierocles replied, breathless but resolute, "My place is with my people, wherever the need is greatest." Valerius nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Very well then. Let us push them back together." With a renewed surge of effort, the defenders rallied, driving the raiders back over the wall and into the darkness beyond. The attackers, realizing they had been repelled, retreated, leaving the city in tense silence once more. As the battle ended, Hierocles stood among the defenders, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his hands trembling. He looked around at the weary faces of the guards, the citizens who had fought so bravely. He knew that this was only the beginning, that there would be more attacks, more tests of their resolve. Valerius approached him, his face grim but grateful. "You fought well, Hierocles, but you are right. You are needed elsewhere. Your strength is not in the sword, but in your words, in your ability to keep us united." Hierocles nodded, understanding the truth in Valerius's words. "You are right, my friend. I will do what I can to keep the spirit of the city strong." In the days that followed, the raiders launched a relentless series of attacks, each one more ferocious than the last. The city's defenders fought bravely, but they were growing weary. Supplies dwindled further, and the strain of the siege began to show. Hierocles continued to move among the people, speaking to them, encouraging them, reminding them of their shared purpose. But he could see the cracks beginning to form. Doubt was creeping in, and fear was taking hold in subtle ways. One afternoon, he overheard a group of citizens muttering to each other, their voices filled with frustration. "We cannot keep this up," one of them said. "We are starving, we are tired. What if they breach the walls? What if we are all slaughtered?" Another replied, "Maybe we should surrender. Maybe it is better to live under their rule than to die here, trapped like animals." Hierocles approached them quietly, his expression calm but firm. "I hear your fears," he said, "and I do not dismiss them. But remember this, to surrender is not just to give up our city, but to give up our principles, our values. We fight not just for survival, but for what is right. Fear can make us forget who we are, but courage can remind us." One of the citizens, a middle-aged woman named Julia, looked at him with tear-filled eyes. "But how can we find courage when all seems lost?" she asked. Hierocles smiled gently. "Courage is not the absence of fear, Julia. It is the decision to act rightly despite it. Remember the Stoic teaching. What is within our control? Not the outcome of this siege, but how we face it, how we stand together, how we choose to respond. We are stronger than we know." The citizens nodded, seeming comforted by his words. But Hierocles knew that comfort would not be enough. They needed more than words. They needed hope, something tangible to hold on to. That night he gathered the city's leaders and proposed a bold plan. "We cannot simply wait for the raiders to break us," he said. "We must show them that we will not be cowed, that we are willing to fight for our freedom, for our values. I suggest we launch a surprise counterattack, a small, targeted strike to disrupt their camp, to show them that we are not afraid." Valerius raised an eyebrow. "A counterattack? With our limited resources?" "Yes," Hierocles replied. "Not a full assault, but a quick, decisive raid. We hit them where they least expect it, disrupt their plans, and then withdraw. It will show them that we are not mere defenders, that we have strength and spirit left." Decimus, still wary but intrigued, asked, "And who would lead this raid?" Hierocles met his gaze. "I will," he said, "and I will take a small group of our best fighters. We will move swiftly, strike hard, and return before they know what hit them." The room fell silent. Finally, Valerius nodded. "It is risky, but it could work. A bold move, Hierocles."
Decimus sighed. "Very well. We have little to lose and much to gain. Let us prepare."
The next night, under the cover of darkness, Hierocles and a small band of fighters slipped out of the city gates, moving silently through the shadows toward the enemy camp. They moved with purpose, their breaths shallow, their eyes sharp. Hierocles felt his heart pounding, but he kept his mind focused on the task at hand. This was not just a raid, it was a test of their resolve, a way to show the raiders that the city would not break. They reached the edge of the enemy camp, where the raiders' tents stood in disarray. Hierocles gave a silent signal, and his men moved swiftly, setting fire to supply tents, cutting the lines of the horses, causing chaos in the enemy ranks. Shouts erupted, and the raiders scrambled in confusion, trying to make sense of the sudden attack. Hierocles and his men struck quickly and retreated just as fast, disappearing into the night before the enemy could regroup. They returned to the city under a veil of darkness, slipping back through the gates to the sound of cheers and relief. The counterattack had been a success. It had not broken the siege, but it had shaken the enemy's confidence. It had reminded the defenders of their strength, their ability to take the initiative, their willingness to fight for their values. The next morning, Hierocles addressed the city once more. "We have shown them that we will not be cowed, that we will not surrender," he declared. "We have shown them the strength of a city united, a city that fights not just with swords, but with spirit." The people cheered, their spirits lifted. For a moment, the weight of the siege seemed lighter, the fear less palpable. But Hierocles knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. The siege would continue, and the challenges would grow. Yet he also knew that they had taken a step in the right direction, that they had proven something to themselves. As the city prepared for the next stage of the siege, Hierocles reflected on the lessons he had learned. He realized that resilience was not a single act of bravery, but a sustained effort, a daily choice to keep moving forward, to keep expanding one's circle of concern, even when the path was unclear. He whispered to himself, "We are not finished yet. There is still more to do, more to fight for, more to learn." Stay with us as Hierocles and the city continue to face the trials of the siege, finding strength in unexpected places, and learning that the greatest battles are often fought within. Chapter 10. The Turning Point. Courage in Unseen Places. The dawn broke over the city with a faint light, diffused by a low-hanging mist that clung to the walls like a second skin. The air was heavy with anticipation and exhaustion, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for whatever would come next. The siege had dragged on for what felt like an eternity, and the initial spark of resilience had begun to flicker, like a candle struggling against the wind. Hierocles stood on the city walls looking out over the raiders' camp. He could see their movements more clearly now. They were becoming bolder, testing the city's defenses with increasing frequency. Supplies inside the walls were running dangerously low, and the strain of the prolonged siege was wearing on the people. Even the most steadfast among them were beginning to show signs of doubt and fatigue. Valerius, the commander of the city's defense, joined Hierocles on the wall. His face was lined with worry, and his normally strong voice had grown tired. "We cannot hold out much longer," he said quietly. "The enemy knows it. They sense our weakness." Hierocles nodded. He had sensed it too. "I know, Valerius. Our food supplies are nearly depleted and morale is slipping. But we cannot surrender. We must find another way." Valerius sighed. "Another way? But what way, Hierocles? We have tried everything. We have fought bravely, but they still stand at our gates, waiting for us to break." Hierocles thought for a moment, his mind racing. He knew that they needed a new plan, something that would shift the balance in their favor, something unexpected. "There is always another way," he murmured. "We need to find a way to break their will, to make them doubt their own strength." Valerius looked at him with a mixture of skepticism and hope. "And how do we do that?" Hierocles turned to him, a glint of determination in his eyes. "By turning their strength against them," he said. "We need to find their weakest point, their greatest vulnerability, and use it to our advantage." Valerius frowned. "And how do we find that? We have been watching them for weeks, and they have not shown any obvious weaknesses." Hierocles smiled slightly. "That is where we need to be creative. We need someone who can slip into their camp, someone who can observe them closely, learn their routines, and find the cracks in their armor." Valerius raised an eyebrow. "You mean a spy?" "Yes," Hierocles replied. "But not just any spy. We need someone they would not suspect, someone who can move among them without drawing attention." Valerius sighed deeply. "It is a risky plan, but at this point, risk may be our only option. Do you have someone in mind?" Hierocles nodded. "There is one who might be able to do it. Leonidas, the refugee who came searching for his son. He knows what it means to be an outsider, to move unseen. He has been observing the enemy closely since the siege began. He might be willing to help." Valerius considered this for a moment. "A refugee? You trust him that much?" Hierocles replied, "I do. He has nothing to lose and much to gain, and he has already proven himself to be resourceful and courageous. Let me speak to him." With that, Hierocles descended from the wall and made his way to the refugee camp. He found Leonidas sitting alone, sharpening a small knife. The lines on his face seemed deeper now, etched with worry and fatigue, but his eyes were still sharp. "Leonidas," Hierocles greeted him, sitting down beside him. "I need your help." Leonidas looked up, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "My help? What could I possibly do?" Hierocles explained the plan, laying out the need for someone to infiltrate the enemy camp, to learn their movements, their weaknesses. "You are a man who knows how to move quietly, how to observe without being seen," Hierocles said. "I believe you could do this." Leonidas was silent for a long moment, weighing the proposal. "And if I am caught?" he asked finally. "They will not spare me." Hierocles nodded. "It is a great risk, I know, but if we do nothing, the city will fall. If we succeed, we might just turn the tide." Leonidas sighed, his gaze shifting to the horizon where the enemy camp lay. "I have already lost much," he murmured. "I have nothing left but this chance." "Very well, Hierocles. I will do it. For my son. for this city that gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go."
Hierocles placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Leonidas. You show great courage. Remember, you are not alone. We will be ready to act on whatever you find."
That night, under the cover of darkness, Leonidas slipped out of the city and made his way toward the enemy camp. His movements were careful, deliberate, his breathing shallow to avoid detection. He crept closer, listening to the sounds of the camp, the chatter of the soldiers, the orders barked by their commanders. For 3 days, Leonidas moved among the enemy, learning their routines, their guard rotations, and their weaknesses. He discovered that the raiders were growing restless. They had expected the city to surrender by now. Supplies in their camp were also running low, and their leaders were struggling to maintain order. On the 3rd night, Leonidas overheard something crucial. 2 of the raider leaders, deep in conversation, spoke of a planned assault on the northern wall, a weak point they had identified. They intended to strike there at dawn, hoping to catch the city unprepared. Leonidas knew he had to act quickly. He slipped back through the shadows, retracing his steps to the city walls. As he approached the gates, he gave the signal that Hierocles had taught him, a low, rhythmic knock, followed by a whistle. The guards opened the gate just wide enough to let him in. Leonidas rushed to find Hierocles, who was waiting anxiously near the gates. "They plan to attack the northern wall at dawn," Leonidas said breathlessly. "They think it is our weakest point. We have a chance to turn the tables." Hierocles nodded, a spark of determination in his eyes. "You've done well, Leonidas. Now, let's use this to our advantage." He quickly summoned Valerius and the other city leaders, explaining the situation. "We will move our best fighters to the northern wall," he instructed. "We will let them think they have the element of surprise, but we will be ready for them. When they attack, we will strike back hard, and we will push them back." Valerius grinned. "A good plan, Hierocles. Let them believe they have the upper hand, and then we will show them our strength." The city prepared through the night, moving soldiers quietly to the northern wall, setting traps and readying their defenses. The hours ticked by slowly, each minute filled with a tense anticipation. As dawn approached, the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the walls. The raiders, as expected, began their assault, rushing toward the northern gate with a fierce battle cry. They believed they had found the city's weakness, that victory was within their grasp, but they were met with a fierce resistance. The city's defenders, prepared and resolute, unleashed a barrage of arrows and stones, driving the raiders back. The traps were sprung, and the enemy forces were caught off guard, thrown into chaos and confusion. Valerius led the charge, his sword gleaming in the morning light. "For Rome!" he shouted, rallying the defenders. They surged forward, pressing the advantage, cutting down the raiders who had dared to breach the walls. Hierocles watched from a higher vantage point, his heart pounding with both fear and hope. He saw the tide turning, saw the enemy faltering, and he knew that this was their moment.
"Push them back!" he shouted. "Show them our strength, our unity!"
The defenders fought with renewed vigor, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that they had anticipated the enemy's move, that they were not merely reacting, but had seized the initiative. The raiders, realizing their plan had failed, began to retreat, their formation broken, their will shaken. By midday, the enemy had pulled back completely, regrouping outside the range of the city's archers. The city of Rome had held once more, and this time they had dealt a serious blow to the raiders' confidence. The citizens cheered, a sense of relief washing over them. For the first time in weeks, they felt hope, a belief that they might survive this siege, that they might emerge victorious. Hierocles descended from the walls to meet Leonidas, who was being treated for a minor wound by one of the healers. He grasped the man's hand tightly. "You have done a great thing today, Leonidas. You have given this city hope." Leonidas nodded, smiling through his exhaustion. I did only what was needed, for my son, and for all of us.
Valerius approached them, clapping Leonidas on the back. You were brave, my friend. You may have just saved us all.
Decimus, who had been watching from a distance, approached slowly. His face, usually so stern, softened slightly. Hierocles, he said quietly, you were right. Compassion, tempered with wisdom, has brought us strength. We would not have known of the attack without your plan, or without Leonidas. Hierocles smiled. This city is strong because of its people, Decimus. All of its people, whether born within these walls or arriving as refugees. We are stronger together than we are apart. Decimus nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. You have my support, Hierocles. Let us continue to stand united, whatever comes next. That night, as the city celebrated its small victory, Hierocles took a quiet moment to reflect. He knew that the siege was far from over, that more challenges lay ahead. But he also knew that they had taken an important step, that they had shown themselves and the enemy the true power of resilience, unity, and the courage to hold to their principles even in the darkest of times. He whispered a Stoic thought to himself, endure and prevail with strength in unity, with wisdom in action. Stay with us as the city, under Hierocles' guidance, faces the final stages of the siege, where courage is tested, alliances are forged, and the ultimate challenge looms ahead.
Conclusion. The triumph of virtue, a Stoic legacy.
The siege dragged on, but the spirit of the city of Rome remained unbroken. Each day brought new tests, new challenges, but also new opportunities for growth and unity. Under Hierocles' guidance, the city had learned to embrace not only its strength, but also its vulnerabilities, recognizing that true resilience was found in the balance between courage and compassion, between action and reflection. Weeks passed, and the raiders, increasingly frustrated by their lack of progress, began to falter. They had hoped to break the city's will through fear and attrition, but instead they found themselves faced with a community that grew stronger with each passing day. A people who stood united not by force, but by a shared commitment to their values and each other. Then, one day, a scout brought word to the city. A larger Roman legion, dispatched from the capital, was marching to their aid. The raiders, realizing they were now outnumbered and outmaneuvered, began to retreat, abandoning their siege and disappearing into the distant hills. The city erupted in celebration. The gates were thrown open, and the people poured into the streets, embracing one another with tears of relief and joy. The sound of laughter and music filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the city for so long. Hierocles stood among them, a quiet smile on his face, feeling the weight of the past weeks lift from his shoulders. Valerius approached him, a broad grin on his weathered face. We did it, Hierocles. We held our ground, and we won. Hierocles nodded. Yes, we did. But our victory is not just in surviving this siege. It is in how we faced it, how we chose to stand together, how we lived our principles even when it was hardest. Decimus, standing nearby, added, Your leadership has been a light for us, Hierocles. You showed us that strength is found in virtue, not just in arms. You taught us that compassion is not a weakness, but the greatest strength of all. Hierocles smiled humbly. I did only what was needed, what was right. The true strength lies within all of you, within all of us. He addressed the gathered crowd, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Citizens of Rome, today we celebrate not just a victory of arms, but a victory of the spirit.
We stood firm, not because we were the strongest, but because we chose to be wise, courageous, just, and compassionate. We expanded our circles of concern to include even those we once saw as strangers, and in doing so, we discovered our true strength. He paused, looking out over the faces of those who had fought and struggled alongside him. This city has proven that it is more than walls and stones. It is a community of souls united by shared values. Let us carry this lesson forward, remembering that our greatest power lies in our ability to remain true to ourselves, to see beyond our fears, and to act with virtue, no matter the circumstances. The crowd erupted in applause, and Hierocles felt a deep sense of peace. The trials they had faced had not been easy, but they had revealed the core of who they were. They had shown that Stoic principles, wisdom, courage, justice, and compassion were not mere words, but a way of life, a path to a deeper understanding of what it meant to be human. In the days that followed, the city began to rebuild. The citizens, now more united than ever, worked side by side with the refugees, repairing the damage from the siege, strengthening their defenses, and sharing stories of bravery and resilience. New friendships were forged, and old prejudices began to fade, replaced by a recognition of their shared humanity. Hierocles continued to teach and guide, knowing that his work was far from over. He understood that the lessons of the siege would need to be remembered and applied, not just in times of crisis, but in everyday life. He saw the concentric circles of concern that he had spoken of so often expanding ever outward, reaching new hearts and minds. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Hierocles stood once more on the walls, looking out over the horizon. He felt a sense of fulfillment, a quiet joy in knowing that his philosophy had made a difference, that his teachings had taken root in a place where they could grow and flourish. He whispered to himself a final Stoic reflection. To live is to strive for virtue, to see oneself in others, to act with courage in the face of fear, and to love wisely. In this, we find the path to true peace. And so Hierocles continued his work, a philosopher who had become more than a teacher, more than a leader. He had become a beacon of Stoic compassion, a living testament to the power of seeing all humanity as one. This has been a story of Stoic principles in action, a story of resilience, courage, and the power of compassion to transform not just a city, but the hearts and minds of all who dwell within it. Presented by Stoic Stories, all rights reserved. Thank you for listening.